While I was under anesthesia for emergency surgery, my husband Judah emptied our joint accounts and filed for divorce, thinking I'd never wake up. "She's basically a vegetable now," he told his lawyer over the phone while I lay in recovery. What he didn't know was that I controlled his family's $2.3 million trust fund, and I was about to cut off every penny while he celebrated with his mistress. The last thing I remembered before everything went black was Judah's hand squeezing mine in the hospital corridor. "I'll be right here when you wake up, Robin," he whispered, his voice thick with what I thought was concern. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "The doctors say it's a routine procedure, but I know you're scared." His wedding ring caught the fluorescent light as he brushed a strand of hair from my forehead. 22 years of marriage, and I still felt that flutter when he touched me like that. The emergency appendectomy had come out of nowhere. What started as mild stomach discomfort during our Saturday morning coffee had escalated into excruciating pain by noon. Judah had driven me to Mercy General himself, holding my hand through each contraction of agony, whispering reassurances as the medical team wheeled me toward the operating room. "Mrs. Blackwood," Dr. Martinez had explained, "your appendix is severely inflamed. We need to operate immediately to prevent rupture. It's a standard procedure, but given the inflammation level, you'll likely be under anesthesia longer than usual, possibly several hours." I'd nodded through the pain, grateful that Judah was handling all the paperwork, the insurance details, the medical decisions. As the anesthesia mask descended over my face, his was the last face I saw, etched with what appeared to be genuine worry. But consciousness returned not to Judah's concerned face, but to the sterile brightness of a recovery room and the sound of his voice drifting through the partially open door. Not the voice of a worried husband, but something else entirely. "No, Emma, she's still out cold," he was saying, his tone casual, almost cheerful. "The surgeon said she had complications, internal bleeding. She's been unconscious for 3 days now, and honestly, the doctors aren't optimistic." My body felt like lead, my throat raw from the breathing tube, but my mind was crystal clear. Emma. I knew that name. Emma Sinclair, the paralegal from Judah's law firm. The woman who'd been working late with him for months. The one who'd been calling our house at odd hours with urgent case questions. "I know, baby, I know," Judah continued, his voice moving closer to my door. "Look, the divorce papers are already filed. I told my lawyer that Robin had been showing signs of dementia for months before the surgery. Memory loss, confusion, inability to handle finances. It'll be easy to prove she's mentally incompetent." My heart monitor must have betrayed my shock, because a nurse appeared almost immediately, checking my vitals with practiced efficiency. "Mrs. Blackwood, can you hear me? You've been unconscious for several days following complications from your appendectomy." Several days. The words hit me like ice water. I tried to speak, but only a croak emerged from my damaged throat. "Don't try to talk yet." The nurse, whose badge read Sophie Chen. "No. Wait," Sophie Martinez soothed. "Your husband has been here constantly. He's just stepped out to make some calls." Some calls. I closed my eyes, processing what I'd overheard. Divorce papers. Mental incompetence. Emma. The pieces began forming a horrifying picture, but I needed to be sure. I needed to understand the full scope of what was happening. When Sophie left, I strained to hear more of Judah's conversation. He'd moved farther down the hall, but his voice carried. "The joint accounts are cleaned out," he was saying. "Business account, savings, even her inheritance fund from her parents. I moved everything to the Cayman account yesterday." She signed all the transfer authorizations months ago. Well, I signed them, but who's going to question a husband managing his vegetative wife's finances? My inheritance. My parents had left me nearly $400,000 when they died in that car accident 5 years ago. Money I'd planned to use for our retirement, for the children we'd never been able to have, for the life we'd built together. Money that was apparently now sitting in an offshore account. By the time she wakes up, if she wakes up, I'll already be in Costa Rica with the new identity Henderson set up, Judah continued. The beauty of it is, even if she recovers, she'll have nothing. No money, no house. I'm selling it tomorrow, and no credibility. A brain-damaged woman claiming her devoted husband stole her money? Please. The casual cruelty in his voice was like nothing I'd ever heard from the man I'd shared a bed with for over 2 decades. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. This was calculated, methodical, planned. But as I lay there, fury building beneath my physical weakness, I realized Judah had made one crucial miscalculation. One oversight that would prove to be his downfall. The Blackwood Family Trust. Judah's grandfather, old Nathaniel Blackwood, had established the trust in 1987 when Judah was just starting law school. The trust contained the family's real estate holdings, investment portfolios, and business interests, worth approximately $2.3 million at last count. Nathaniel had been very specific about the trust's management. It required 2 signatures for any major transaction, and those signatures had to come from both Judah and his spouse. What Judah apparently didn't remember, or perhaps had never fully understood, was that when we married, I didn't just become a signatory on the trust. Due to a peculiarity in Nathaniel's will and the trust documents, I had become the primary trustee. Judah could access funds for reasonable expenses, but any major withdrawals, any changes to beneficiaries, any dissolution of the trust required, my approval and signature, my signature. The same signature he'd been forging on our joint accounts, but couldn't forge on trust documents that required notarized witnessed signatures and biometric verification at the bank. For 22 years, I'd managed our household finances while Judah focused on his law practice. I'd balanced our books, managed our investments, and yes, I'd quietly overseen the trust that provided a significant portion of our comfortable lifestyle. The monthly distributions from the trust paid our mortgage, funded our vacations, and supplemented Judah's income from his small-town law practice. Without access to the trust, Judah's new life in Costa Rica would be funded entirely by what he'd stolen from our joint accounts. Substantial, but not enough for the lifestyle he was clearly planning. As his voice faded down the corridor, probably heading back to Emma or to make more arrangements for his escape, I lay in that hospital bed and felt something I'd never experienced before. Not just anger, but a cold, calculating fury that seemed to sharpen my thinking despite my physical weakness. Judah thought he'd planned the perfect crime. He'd waited for the ideal moment, a medical emergency that left me vulnerable and unconscious. He'd covered his legal bases with divorce papers and competency claims. He'd stolen everything he thought mattered, but he'd forgotten the most important thing. Never underestimate a woman who's spent 22 years managing the very money you think you've stolen. I had work to do. To understand how completely Judah had deceived me, you need to know what our life looked like before that operating room. From the outside, we were the picture of small-town success. The respected lawyer and his devoted wife, living in a beautiful colonial on Maple Street in Millbrook, Vermont, population 8400. I'd moved to Millbrook fresh out of college, taking a job as a financial advisor at Vermont Community Bank. It wasn't glamorous work, but I had a knack for numbers and genuinely enjoyed helping people plan for their futures. The elderly couples saving for retirement, the young families planning for their children's education. I found purpose in protecting their financial security. That's where I first encountered the Blackwood Family Trust. Old Nathaniel Blackwood had been one of Millbrook's founding families, and his grandson Judah was making waves as a promising young attorney. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When Nathaniel came in to restructure his family's assets, I was the one who walked him through the complex trust documentation. My grandson's a smart boy, Nathaniel had told me, his weathered hands shaking slightly as he signed the papers. But he's got no head for money management. Spends like water flows downhill. That's why I need someone sharp to keep an eye on things. The trust was unusual in its structure. Rather than simply appointing Judah as the beneficiary with standard controls, Nathaniel had insisted on what he called a partnership model. When Judah married, his spouse would automatically become co-trustee with equal authority. It was Nathaniel's way of ensuring the family money wouldn't be squandered by someone who'd never learned the value of a dollar. Young people today, he'd chuckled, they think money grows on trees. But a good spouse, someone with sense about finances, they'll keep him grounded. I'd met Judah 6 months later at a charity auction for the hospital. He was representing one of the donors in a legal matter, looking handsome in his perfectly tailored suit, charming the room with his easy smile and quick wit. When he bid on a weekend getaway package just to keep the auction lively, then immediately donated it back for re-auction, I was smitten. Our courtship was everything a small-town romance should be. Dinner dates at Romano's, the nicest restaurant in town. Weekend drives through the Vermont countryside, stopping at antique shops and farmers markets. He brought me flowers every Friday, always remembering that I preferred wildflowers to roses because they felt more genuine. "You're not like other women I've dated," he told me on our 3rd month together, as we walked along the river behind the old mill. "You're grounded, real. You understand what matters in life." What I thought mattered, apparently, was building a life together. When Judah proposed on Christmas Eve, in front of my parents' fireplace, I believed I'd found my forever person. The far man who would hold my hand through whatever life brought us. Our wedding was small but perfect. Held in my parents' backyard, with white lights strung through the maple trees, and my mother's roses in full bloom. Judah's parents had died in a plane crash when he was in college, so it was mostly my extended family and friends from town. Nathaniel, despite being in his 80s, insisted on walking me down the aisle since my father was recovering from hip surgery. "You take good care of my boy," he whispered as he placed my hand in Judah's. "And don't let him forget where his bread gets buttered." I'd laughed at the time, thinking it was just an old man's way of saying family money came with responsibility. I had no idea it was practically a job description. The early years of our marriage were blissful. Judah's law practice grew steadily, specializing in estate planning and business law. I continued working at the bank, eventually becoming the senior financial advisor. We bought the house on Maple Street, a 1920s colonial that needed work but had good bones and a perfect view of the mountains. We tried for children for years, month after month of hope and disappointment, expensive fertility treatments that drained our emotions and our savings. When we finally accepted that children weren't in our future, we poured that parental energy into our community instead. Judah served on the school board. I volunteered with the literacy program. We became the couple other people looked up to, the ones who had their lives figured out. What I didn't realize was how carefully Judah had positioned me from the very beginning. My job at the bank gave me the perfect credentials to manage the family trust. My natural inclination toward financial caution made me the ideal guardian of the Blackwood money. My devotion to him made me the perfect cover for whatever he was really planning. Over the years, I'd watched the trust grow from $1.8 million to $2.3 million through careful investments and prudent management. The monthly distributions supported our comfortable lifestyle, the house payments, the vacation to Europe for our 10th anniversary, the new cars every few years. Judah never seemed particularly interested in the details of how the money was managed, always saying, "That's what I have you for, sweetheart." I thought it was because he trusted me. Now I wondered if it was because he was planning this all along. The signs had been there, if I'd been looking for them. the late nights at the office that became more frequent over the past year, the cell phone that was suddenly password protected, the business trips to Burlington that seemed to happen more often than his caseload warranted, Emma's calls at odd hours, always with some urgent question that couldn't wait until morning. But I'd trusted him. After 22 years of marriage, suspicion felt like betrayal. When your husband tells you he's working late, you believe him. When he says a colleague needs to discuss a case, you don't question it. When he handles the finances during a medical emergency, you're grateful for his care. That trust had been my greatest weakness. And now, lying in this hospital bed with machines monitoring my every heartbeat, I understood it would have to become my greatest strength. Looking back now, the warning signs had been there for months, subtle but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Judah was too smart for that. Instead, it had been a gradual erosion of our normal patterns, so slow that I'd attributed each change to work stress or the natural evolution of a long marriage. It started with the phone calls. Emma Sinclair had joined Judah's law firm as a paralegal in January, and by March, she was calling our house at least 3 times a week, always with urgent questions about cases, always needing to speak to Judah immediately. At first, I'd been impressed by her dedication. "That new paralegal of yours is certainly thorough," I'd commented one evening after Emma had called during dinner for the second time that week. "She's very detail-oriented," Judah had replied, not looking up from his plate. "It's refreshing to work with someone who takes the job seriously." I should have noticed how his voice changed when he talked about her. Should have paid attention to the way he'd started combing his hair differently, updating his wardrobe with more expensive suits. Should have questioned why he suddenly needed to work so many evenings and weekends. But trust is a powerful blinder. When you've been married for over 20 years, you don't automatically assume your husband is lying when he says he needs to review depositions at the office. You don't question why he's suddenly protective of his phone, or why he started showering immediately when he comes home from work. The financial changes were more subtle, but, in retrospect, more telling. In April, Judah had casually mentioned that we should consolidate our accounts to make banking easier. "Too many different statements to keep track of," he'd said. "Why don't we move everything into the joint account at First National? It'll simplify our taxes." I'd agreed, thinking it made sense. My salary went into direct deposit, the trust distributions came monthly, and our expenses were predictable. Having everything in one place would indeed make tracking easier. What I didn't realize was that consolidation also made theft easier. By May, Judah had started making comments about my memory. Little things at first, suggesting I'd forgotten conversations we'd had, questioning whether I'd paid certain bills. "Are you feeling okay, honey?" he'd ask with what seemed like genuine concern. "You seem a little scattered lately." I'd attributed it to stress. The bank had been going through a restructuring, and my workload had increased significantly. Some days I did feel overwhelmed, forgetting small details or losing track of appointments. It seemed natural that Judah would notice and worry. "Maybe you should consider stepping back from work," he'd suggested one evening in June, after I'd mentioned feeling tired. "We don't really need your income with the trust distributions. You could volunteer more, maybe take up that pottery class you mentioned." The idea had been tempting. At 53, I was tired of the constant pressure of managing other people's money while watching my own become increasingly complex. But something held me back. An instinct I couldn't quite name. "I like working," I'd told him. "It gives me purpose." "Your purpose is here, with me," he'd replied, kissing my forehead. "But I understand. Just promise me you'll think about it." By July, the late nights had become routine. Judah would come home after 9, claiming he'd been preparing for trials or meeting with clients. He'd started going to the office on Saturdays, something he'd rarely done in previous years. "Big case coming up," he'd explain. "Real estate dispute that could set a precedent." Emma's been invaluable in organizing the documentation. Emma. Always Emma. I'd started to feel like a third wheel in conversations about my husband's work life. Emma had suggested this legal strategy. Emma had found this obscure precedent. Emma had stayed late to help with that brief. When do I get to meet this legal superstar? I'd asked one evening, trying to keep my tone light. Oh, you know how it is, Judah had said dismissively. Work relationships and personal relationships don't really mix. Besides, she's pretty focused on her career. Not much time for socializing. In August, things escalated. Judah started receiving phone calls that he'd take in private, stepping out onto the porch or into his home office with the door closed. When I'd ask about them later, he'd dismiss them as client consultations or discussions with other attorneys. Attorney-client privilege, he'd say with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. You know I can't discuss the details. But these calls came at odd hours. Early morning, late evening, sometimes during dinner. And they left him energized in a way I hadn't seen in years. He'd come back from these conversations with a spring in his step, sometimes humming under his breath. The physical changes were perhaps the most obvious, though I'd been too trusting to see them clearly. Judah had always been reasonably fit, but suddenly he was going to the gym regularly, updating his wardrobe, even considering cosmetic dentistry to whiten his teeth. Just want to look professional for my clients, he'd explained when I'd complimented his new appearance. Image matters in law. But the man who'd worn the same cologne for 20 years suddenly switched to something more expensive. The man who'd been content with department store shirts was now shopping at boutiques. The man who'd gotten the same haircut for decades was experimenting with different styles. In September, just 2 months before my surgery, Judah had made what I now realize was his most telling comment. We'd been discussing our retirement plans over dinner when he'd said, almost casually, "You know, Robin, you should probably update your will. Make sure everything's in order, just in case." Just in case what? I'd asked, surprised by the sudden morbid turn in conversation. You never know what life might throw at you, he'd replied. Medical emergencies, accidents, it's just responsible. Planning. I'd agreed to update my will, never imagining that the medical emergency would come so soon, or that my own husband would be the one throwing curves at my life. Looking back, I wonder if he'd already started planning my appendectomy, not the surgery itself, but the opportunity it would provide. The full scope of Judah's betrayal revealed itself over the next 48 hours, piece by devastating piece. What I'd initially thought was opportunistic theft during my medical crisis was actually the culmination of months of systematic planning, executed with the precision of a seasoned criminal. Sophie Martinez, my recovery nurse, became my unwitting ally in uncovering the truth. She was naturally chatty, the kind of person who filled silence with conversation, and her observations about my devoted husband painted a picture that made my blood run cold. Your husband has been so attentive, she said while checking my IV on my second day of consciousness. He's been here every day since your surgery. Though it's odd, he always seems to time his visits around shift changes, almost like he doesn't want the same nurses seeing him too often. That comment stuck with me. Judah was methodical about everything, from his legal cases to his morning routine. Random timing wasn't his style. Has he been here today? I asked, my voice still raspy from the breathing tube. Oh yes, early this morning around 6. He brought fresh clothes and said he'd be back this evening. Mentioned he had some important appointments in Burlington today. Sophie adjusted my pillows with practiced efficiency. Real estate agents, he said. Something about preparing your house for when you're ready to come home. Real estate agents. The words hit me like a physical blow. In my weakened state, I must have shown my shock, because Sophie immediately checked my monitors. Are you feeling dizzy? Should I call Dr. Martinez? No, I managed. Just tired. But I wasn't tired. I was calculating. If Judah was meeting with real estate agents, he wasn't preparing our house for my recovery. He was preparing to sell it. Just as he'd mentioned in that phone call with Emma about liquidating everything before disappearing to Costa Rica. That afternoon, when Sophie thought I was napping, I overheard her conversation with another nurse at the station just outside my room. "The husband in 314 gives me the creeps," Sophie was saying. "Yesterday he was asking detailed questions about her prognosis, but not in a worried way. More like he was confirming something he already expected." "What kind of questions?" the other nurse asked. "Timeline stuff. How long she'd likely be hospitalized. What kind of cognitive issues she might have. Whether she'd need long-term care. And when I mentioned that her recovery was actually remarkably good, he seemed disappointed. Disappointed. My husband was disappointed that I was recovering well from major surgery. Plus, Sophie continued, I've worked here for 8 years, and I've never seen a spouse who doesn't bring personal items from home. No photos, no favorite blanket, nothing to make the room more comfortable. It's like he expects this to be temporary. Because he did expect it to be temporary. Either I would die from complications, or I would be declared mentally incompetent and moved to a long-term care facility. Either way, I'd be gone, and he'd be free to disappear with Emma and my money. The next piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Dr. Martinez made his evening rounds while Judah was visiting, and I pretended to be asleep to hear their conversation. Her recovery continues to exceed our expectations, Dr. Martinez was saying. The cognitive function tests show no impairment from the anesthesia or the complications. She should be able to return to normal activities within a few weeks. That's wonderful news, Judah replied, but his tone suggested anything but joy. Though I have to say, doctor, she's been showing some signs of confusion at home for months before this surgery. Memory lapses, difficulty managing finances, that sort of thing. My eyes snapped open before I could stop myself. Judah was laying groundwork for an incompetency claim, right here in my hospital room, with my doctor. Really? Dr. Martinez sounded surprised. Because her responses to our cognitive assessments have been sharp. She remembered details from years ago, solved complex problems, showed excellent reasoning skills. Well, she has good days and bad days, Judah said smoothly. The stress of managing our finances has been overwhelming for her lately. I've had to take over most of our banking and investments. Banking and investments. The trust. Suddenly, I understood why he'd been so eager to have me step back from work, so insistent on consolidating our accounts. He'd been positioning himself as my financial caretaker, establishing a pattern that would support his claims of my incompetence. Dr. Martinez's response was professional, but cooler. We'll continue monitoring her cognitive function, of course. But from what I've observed, Mrs. Blackwood's mental acuity appears completely normal. After they left, I lay in the darkness processing what I'd learned. Judah hadn't just stolen my money and planned to abandon me. He'd been systematically undermining my credibility for months, creating a narrative of mental decline that would discredit anything I might say after he was gone. The financial picture became clearer the next morning when I managed to access my phone while Sophie was helping another patient. The text messages were devastating. Alerts from our bank about large withdrawals, transfer confirmations, and finally, the most damning message of all, account closure completed. Remaining balance transferred as requested. $400,000 from my parents' inheritance. Gone. $120,000 from our joint savings. Gone. $53,000 from my retirement account. Gone. Even the small checking account I'd maintained separately, with money I'd saved from birthday gifts and small bonuses over the years. Gone. But as I scrolled through the financial devastation, I realized something Judah hadn't accounted for. He'd been so focused on liquidating our jointly held assets that he'd forgotten about the automatic payments. The trust distributions that came into our joint account every month, the insurance payments that came from the trust's investment income, the property tax payments that were automatically deducted from the trust's bank account. All of those automated systems were still running, still tied to accounts that required my authorization to change. Judah had stolen our liquid assets, but the trust, the real money, was still beyond his reach. More importantly, those automatic payments would continue whether I was conscious or not, and when they stopped, which they would, the moment I revoked his access, everyone would notice. The insurance company, the tax assessor, the investment firm that managed the trust's portfolio. There would be a paper trail of questions that even Emma's paralegal skills couldn't smooth over. As I lay there planning my next moves, one more piece of information fell into place. Sophie mentioned that Judah had requested copies of all my medical records, claiming he needed them for insurance purposes. Seemed odd, she confided. Usually, families wait until discharge for that kind of paperwork, but he was very insistent, said he needed to file claims immediately. Insurance claims, or evidence to support his story that I was mentally incompetent due to surgical complications. Either way, he was building a case that would justify whatever he planned to do next. The pattern was unmistakable now. Every conversation, every document request, every seemingly caring gesture had been calculated to support his ultimate plan. I wasn't just a victim of theft, I was the target of an elaborate fraud designed to erase me completely. The true horror of my situation became clear when I realized this wasn't Judah's first attempt at financial manipulation. It was simply his most ambitious. The methodical way he'd dismantled my life suggested practice, experience, a comfort level with deception that could only come from repetition. It started with a memory that surfaced during my third night in recovery. Unable to sleep, my mind wandering through years of marriage, I remembered something that had seemed insignificant at the time. 3 years ago, Judah had briefly dated a woman named Catherine Mills before we'd met. She'd moved to Millbrook after her divorce, and Judah had helped her with some legal matters. Their relationship had lasted about 8 months. Catherine had left town abruptly, and when I'd asked Judah about it, he'd been dismissive. She couldn't handle small-town life, he'd said. Went back to Boston where she belonged. But now I remembered something else. Catherine had been a successful real estate investor with significant assets. She'd moved to Millbrook specifically because she'd inherited property here from a distant relative. The coincidence felt too convenient now. A wealthy woman, new to town, no local connections, requiring legal help. Exactly the kind of vulnerable target Judah would find attractive. My suspicions deepened when I remembered another woman, Sandra Whitman, an elderly widow who'd been a client of Judah's law firm when I first met him. Sandra had been sharp as a tack, but she'd developed what everyone called sudden onset dementia. About 6 months after signing over financial power of attorney to Judah for some routine estate planning. She'd been moved to a nursing home in Burlington, and her considerable assets had been liquidated to pay for her care. At the time, everyone had praised Judah for his compassionate handling of Sandra's deteriorating condition. He'd managed her finances with such care, they said. He'd made sure she got the best medical attention available. He'd even visited her regularly at the nursing home until she passed away 2 years later. But now, lying in this hospital bed with my own competency, being questioned, I wondered if Sandra's dementia had been as sudden and inexplicable as everyone believed. I wondered if those compassionate visits had been to ensure her silence, to monitor her condition, to make sure his story held up under scrutiny. The pattern was becoming clearer. Judah didn't just steal money. He stole lives. He found women with assets and no strong family connections, gained their trust, then systematically destroyed their credibility while emptying their accounts. The medical emergency approach with me was just a variation on his proven method. But I was different from his previous victims in one crucial way: the Blackwood family trust. Unlike Sandra's simple estate or Catherine's real estate investments, the trust had built-in protections that Nathaniel had specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of manipulation. That realization led to another disturbing thought. If Judah had been planning this for years, Why had he married me at all? The answer came with sickening clarity. He hadn't known about my role in the trust when he'd first pursued me. He'd learned about it only after we were married, when the trust documents were updated to reflect his new marital status. I could imagine his surprise when he'd discovered that his new wife wasn't just another victim to be fleeced, but the gatekeeper to his family's fortune. That knowledge had probably extended our marriage by decades. He couldn't simply divorce me or eliminate me without losing access to the trust entirely. Until now. With me supposedly brain-damaged and incompetent, he could argue that the trust needed new management. Emma, with her paralegal background, could help him navigate the legal complexities of having me declared unfit. They could drag out the process for months or even years, accessing trust funds for my care while systematically draining the accounts. The cruelest part was how he'd used my own professional skills against me. My expertise in financial management had made me the perfect trustee in Nathaniel's eyes, but it had also made me the perfect target in Judah's plan. Who better to manage complex financial fraud than someone who understood exactly how the systems worked? But Judah had made one critical error in his calculations. He'd assumed that my loyalty and love would make me passive, that my trust in him would blind me to his deceptions. He'd counted on my isolation, no children to advocate for me, parents who'd died years ago, a small circle of friends who would accept his version of my mental decline. What he hadn't counted on was my anger, the fury that burned through my physical, weakness, sharpening my mind even as my body struggled to recover. He'd underestimated the woman who'd spent 25 years protecting other people's financial security. The woman who'd built her career on spotting inconsistencies and preventing fraud. As I lay there in the darkness, listening to the steady beep of monitors and the soft footsteps of night shift nurses, I began to understand something that Judah couldn't have anticipated. His betrayal hadn't just stolen my money and threatened my life. It had liberated me from the last traces of love and loyalty that might have held me back from total war. He'd wanted a victim. Instead, he'd created an enemy with nothing left, to lose and everything necessary to destroy him. The turning point came on my 4th morning in the hospital, when I overheard a conversation that shattered any remaining illusions about Judah's intentions. I'd been pretending to sleep during visiting hours, gathering intelligence while he thought I was unconscious. But what I heard that morning transformed me from victim to warrior. Judah was speaking to someone on his phone, his voice low, but not low enough. "Henderson, we need to accelerate the timeline. The doctors are saying she might recover more fully than we anticipated." Henderson. I recognized that name from the divorce papers I'd glimpsed in Judah's briefcase months ago. His lawyer, the one specializing in complex asset cases. "No, she's still heavily sedated most of the time," Judah continued. "But we can't risk her becoming fully coherent before the competency hearing. Can you move it up to next week?" Competency hearing. Next week. My heart rate spiked, but I forced myself to remain still, to keep breathing steadily while my world tilted on its axis. Good. And Emma's prepared to testify about Robin's deteriorating mental state over the past months. She has documentation of conversations where Robin seemed confused, forgetful. It'll support our narrative perfectly. Emma. His paralegal mistress was going to testify against me in court, using fabricated evidence to have me declared mentally incompetent. The woman he was planning to run away with was also helping him steal my life in the most methodical way possible. "The house closing is set for Friday," Judah went on. "I told the buyers it was an estate sale. Widow needed to relocate for medical care. They didn't ask many questions, especially at that price. Our house. The home where I'd planted a garden every spring for 20 years, where I'd dreamed of growing old with the man I loved. He was selling it at a discount to ensure a quick sale, probably telling people I was already dead, or as good as dead. Trust funds will be more complicated, I know, but once she's declared incompetent, I'll be appointed as her financial guardian." From there, it's just a matter of demonstrating that the trust assets need to be liquidated for her long-term care expenses. That's when I understood the full scope of his plan. He wasn't just stealing what we had, he was positioning himself to control the $2.3 million trust indefinitely. He would have me declared incompetent, then systematically drain the trust over months or years, claiming it was all for my care while I was locked away in some facility, probably heavily medicated, to prevent me from contradicting his story. "Costa Rica can wait," he said, his voice taking on a satisfied tone. "This is bigger than we originally planned. We're talking about generational wealth, not just a quick score." The casual way he discussed destroying my life, the businesslike tone as he planned to imprison me and steal everything I'd worked for, ignited something inside me that I'd never felt before. Not anger. Anger was too small a word for what burned through me in that moment. It was rage refined into purpose, fury crystallized into deadly focus. I waited until Judah left for his lunch meeting with the real estate agents before I made my move. Sophie was changing my IV when I finally spoke with full clarity for the first time since waking up. "Sophie, I need your help, and I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you." She looked surprised by the strength in my voice, the alertness in my eyes. "Mrs. Blackwood, you seem much more present today." "I've been present for days," I said. "I've been pretending to be more sedated than I am because I needed to understand what my husband was planning. And what he's planning is going to destroy me unless I stop him first." Sophie's professional demeanor shifted to concern. "I don't understand. Your husband has been very devoted, very concerned about your welfare. My husband is planning to have me declared mentally incompetent so he can steal my family's trust fund and disappear with his mistress. He's selling our house while I'm lying here. He's scheduled a competency hearing for next week, and he's coaching witnesses to lie about my mental state." The words tumbled out, each one sharp and clear and undeniable. Sophie's expression moved, from confusion to shock to something approaching belief as I laid out the evidence I'd gathered over the past few days. "I need you to help me contact my bank," I continued. "I need to make some phone calls that Judah can't know about. And I need to do it before he comes back from his meeting." Sophie hesitated, clearly torn between professional protocol and what she was hearing. "Mrs. Blackwood, these are serious accusations. Maybe we should involve the hospital social worker or call the police. The police will want proof, and by the time I gather enough evidence to convince them, Judah will have succeeded. The competency hearing is next week. Once I'm declared incompetent, everything I say will be dismissed as the ravings of a brain-damaged woman." I reached out and grasped her hand with strength that surprised us both. "Sophie, I spent 25 years helping people protect their money from exactly this kind of fraud. Trust me when I tell you that time is the only advantage I have right now. Help me use it." Something in my voice, or perhaps the clarity in my eyes, convinced her. She nodded slowly. "What do you need me to do?" With Sophie's help, I began what would become the most crucial planning session of my life. We had maybe 2 hours before Judah returned from his real estate meeting, and I needed to use every minute to establish the foundation for my counterattack. "First, I need to understand exactly what assets he's accessed," I told Sophie as she helped me sit up properly for the first time in days. The movement made my incision ache, but the pain sharpened my focus. "Can you get me access to a computer? I need to check the trust accounts." Sophie looked uncertain. "The hospital has computers for patient use, but they're monitored. If your husband checks your browsing history..." "He won't think to check. He believes I'm too brain damaged to use a computer coherently." The bitterness in my voice surprised me. That's going to be his first mistake. While Sophie went to arrange computer access, I used the time to organize my thoughts. My 25 years in financial services had taught me that successful fraud prevention required 3 things: documentation, timing, and leverage. Judah thought he had all three working in his favor, but he'd made crucial miscalculations. Documentation. He'd been forging my signatures for months, but the trust required biometric verification for major transactions. My fingerprints, retinal scan, and voice recognition were still the keys to the kingdom, and there was no way to fake those. Timing. He'd rushed his timeline because of my unexpected recovery, but rushing creates mistakes. The competency hearing was scheduled for next week, but legal processes could be delayed if new evidence emerged. Leverage. He thought he held all the cards, but he'd forgotten about the automatic systems. The trust's monthly distributions, the insurance payments, the investment transfers, all of those were still running on schedules that only I could modify. Sophie returned with a laptop and an apologetic expression. I told them you needed to check your email for insurance information. They said you could use it for 20 minutes. That's all I need. My fingers felt clumsy at first, but muscle memory kicked in as I navigated to the trust's online portal. The login screen appeared, requesting my credentials. Username, R. Blackwood, trustee password, Nathaniel 1987. I'd never changed it from the combination of Judah's grandfather's name and the year the trust was established. The dashboard loaded, and my breath caught in my throat. The trust balance showed $2,347,892.33, almost exactly what it should be. Judah hadn't been able to access the principal, but when I checked the distribution history, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Sophie, look at this. I pointed to a series of pending transactions scheduled for tomorrow. He's set up automatic distributions to be sent to what looks like a medical facility account. $40,000 monthly, supposedly for my long-term care. Sophie peered at the screen. But you're not in long-term care. Exactly. This is how he plans to drain the trust legally. Once I'm declared incompetent, these will look like legitimate medical expenses. $40,000 a month would empty the trust in less than 5 years. I scrolled through more screens, my financial training taking over despite my physical weakness. The picture became clearer with each click. Judah had been extraordinarily thorough in his preparation. He'd established relationships with a private care facility in Burlington, complete with medical staff who would presumably support his narrative about my condition. He'd prepared legal documents that would give him broad discretionary power over my care and finances. He'd even arranged for Emma to have legal access to certain accounts as my patient advocate. This is incredible, I murmured, part horrified and part impressed by the sophistication of his fraud. He's not just stealing money. He's creating an entire false reality where I'm permanently incapacitated and he's my heroic caregiver. But as I dug deeper into the trust's security settings, I found my first real advantage. Nathaniel had been paranoid about financial fraud, probably because he'd seen what happened to other wealthy families. The trust had features that even I had forgotten about. Emergency protocols that could lock down all accounts if suspicious activity was detected. Sophie, I need to make a phone call to the trust's administrator. Her name is Jean Patterson, and she's worked with this family for 30 years. She knew Nathaniel personally, and she knows me. Jean Patterson answered on the second ring, her familiar voice immediately concerned when she heard my shaky greeting. Robin? My goodness, I heard about your surgery from Judah. How are you feeling? Jean, I need your help with something urgent, and I need you to listen carefully without asking questions until I'm finished. I spent the next 10 minutes explaining the situation, providing specific details about the forged signatures, the pending distributions, and the competency hearing. Jean's silence grew more ominous with each revelation. Robin, she finally said, her voice tight with anger. I never authorized those distribution changes. In fact, I've been trying to reach you for weeks about some irregularities in the account activity. What kind of irregularities? Signature verification requests that didn't match our records. Attempts to access historical trust documents. Someone has been probing our security systems, probably trying to understand how to bypass our protections. This was better than I'd hoped. Jean, I need you to implement the emergency protocols. Lock down everything until I can meet with you. In person. Already done, she said grimly. As of this moment, all trust accounts are frozen pending a full security review. No distributions, no changes. Nothing moves without your physical presence and biometric verification. I felt the first surge of hope I'd experienced since waking up. How long can you maintain the freeze? Indefinitely, unless ordered otherwise by a court. And Robin? I've been in this business for 40 years. I've seen every kind of financial fraud imaginable. What your husband is attempting is sophisticated, but it's not foolproof. We're going to stop him. With the trust accounts frozen, I had bought myself precious time, but I needed concrete evidence to stop Judah permanently. Jean Patterson's next revelation would prove to be the key to unraveling his entire scheme. Robin, there's something else you need to know, Jean said, her voice dropping to a whisper despite being alone in her office. About 3 weeks ago, someone attempted to access your grandfather-in-law's original trust documents. The request came through official channels, claiming to be from your husband's law firm, but something felt off. My pulse quickened. What kind of access? They wanted copies of the original 1987 trust agreement, specifically the sections dealing with trustee, succession, and incapacity provisions. When I called Judah's office to verify, Emma Sinclair told me it was for estate planning purposes, updating your wills. Emma again. Every thread of this conspiracy led back to her. Did you provide the documents? No. Our policy requires both. Trustees to request historical documents in person with proper identification. But Robin, the request itself tells us something important. They were researching exactly how to remove you as trustee. I closed my eyes, processing this information. Jean, I need you to pull every record of contact with Judah's office for the past year. Phone calls, emails, document requests, everything. I'll have that ready within the hour. But there's more. Jean's voice grew grimmer. Last month, we received an inquiry from a medical facility in Burlington called Serenity Springs Care Center. They wanted information about setting up automated payments for a patient named Robin Blackwood. Serenity Springs. I made a mental note of the name. What did you tell them? That we don't establish payment arrangements without direct authorization from the trustee. But I looked them up afterward, and Robin, something's very wrong with that place. What do you mean? It's privately owned, cash only, no insurance accepted. Their website talks about specialized care for clients with complex family situations. The whole operation screams money laundering or worse. After ending the call with Jean, I asked Sophie to help me access the internet again. I needed to research Serenity Springs and understand exactly what kind of prison Judah had planned for me. The care facility's website was professionally designed but vague about specifics. Phrases like discretionary care for sensitive situations and complete privacy for families in transition sent chills down my spine. The photo gallery showed luxurious private rooms that looked more like hotel suites than medical facilities. But it was the staff credentials that revealed the truth. Dr. Marcus Webb, the medical director, had a history of working with patients who had complex psychological needs. His previous position had been at a private psychiatric facility that had been shut down for Medicare fraud. Sophie, look at this, I said, pointing to the screen. The head nurse, Patricia Vance, was previously employed at a facility in Florida that specialized in memory care for affluent families. That place was investigated for keeping patients sedated beyond medical necessity. Sophie read over my shoulder, her expression darkening. This isn't a legitimate care facility. It's a place to hide people. Exactly. And once I was declared incompetent and transferred there, who would question my condition? Who would investigate? If I seemed confused or incoherent during the rare visits from court-appointed advocates, I continued researching, using my financial background to dig into the business records. Serenity Springs had been incorporated just 8 months ago, with startup funding that came from a series of shell companies. The paper trail was deliberately complex, but not so complex that someone with my training couldn't follow it. Sophie, I need to make another call. Can you get me access to a phone that won't show up on the hospital records? She handed me her personal cell phone. Use this. Who are you calling? A private investigator I used to work with at the bank. If anyone can uncover the full extent of this conspiracy, it's Dominic Torres. Dominic answered on the first ring, his familiar, gravelly voice immediately concerned when he heard my situation. Robin, what the hell is going on? I heard through the grapevine that you were in the hospital, but this sounds like something out of a crime novel. Dom, I need a full background check on Emma Sinclair, employee at Judah's law firm. And I need you to investigate Serenity Springs Care Center in Burlington. I think they're connected to a larger operation. Give me 6 hours, he said. And Robin, be careful. If half of what you're telling me is true, these people have killed before. The rest of the afternoon was spent methodically documenting everything I'd discovered. Using Sophie's help, I created a detailed timeline of events, cross-referenced, with financial records and correspondence. The pattern that emerged was damning. Judah and Emma had been planning this for at least a year, possibly longer. They'd researched the legal requirements for declaring someone incompetent, identified a facility willing to provide false medical records, and established financial structures that would allow them to drain the trust over several years while maintaining the appearance of legitimate medical expenses. But they'd made mistakes. The electronic trail was extensive, and their communications had been careless. Emma had used her work email to correspond with Serenity Springs. Judah had researched Costa Rican immigration law on his office computer. The care facility had a documented history of fraud. When Dominic called back that evening, his information confirmed my worst fears and provided the final pieces of evidence I needed. Robin, Emma Sinclair isn't who she claims to be. Her real name is Emma Castellanos, and she's been involved in at least 3 similar schemes over the past decade. She specializes in targeting older, isolated individuals with assets. She's been arrested twice, but never convicted. And Serenity Springs? It's a front. They've housed a dozen patients over the past 8 months, all wealthy individuals who were declared incompetent by family members. None of them have been seen by independent medical professionals since admission. I closed my eyes, imagining the horror of being trapped in such a place, drugged into compliance while my assets were systematically stolen. Dom, I need you to contact the State Attorney General's office. This is bigger than just my case, the scope of the conspiracy became crystal clear the next morning when Dominic delivered information that transformed my understanding of what I was fighting. This wasn't just about my husband's betrayal. It was about a sophisticated criminal network that had been operating for years. Robin, you need to hear this, Dominic said during our early morning call, his voice grim with the weight of what he'd uncovered. Emma Castellanos, your husband's paralegal, has been running this same con for over a decade. She's not working alone, and Judah isn't her first lawyer accomplice. I gripped Sophie's phone tighter, my knuckles white against the plastic. What do you mean? She's part of an organized ring. They target small-town attorneys who are struggling financially or have gambling debts, personal problems, anything that makes them vulnerable to corruption. Emma provides the legal expertise and connections. They provide the local credibility and access to potential victims. The pieces began clicking into place with horrifying clarity. Judah's been having money problems, hasn't he? Big ones. I pulled his financial records. The man is drowning in debt. Credit cards maxed out. Second mortgage on your house that you probably don't know about. And here's the kicker. He owes serious money to some very unpleasant people in Burlington. The kind who break kneecaps when you don't pay up. That explained so much. The stress I'd attributed to work pressures, the late nights I'd thought were about building his practice, the lifestyle inflation that had seemed gradual but was actually desperate attempts to maintain appearances while drowning financially. Emma didn't just seduce him romantically, Dominic continued. She offered him a lifeline when he was about to lose everything. All he had to do was identify potential targets and provide legal cover for the operation. How many others have there been? In Vermont alone? At least 6 that I can confirm. Catherine Mills, the woman who left town so suddenly 3 years ago? She didn't leave voluntarily. She's been a patient at a facility in New Hampshire ever since, declared incompetent after a mysterious decline in mental health. Her assets have been slowly liquidated to pay for her care. My stomach turned. And Sandra Whitman? Dead 2 years ago, just like you thought. But not from natural causes. The facility where she was being held had 3 other patients die. Within 6 months of each other, all from similar circumstances. The state investigated, but couldn't prove anything conclusive. I closed my eyes, processing the magnitude of what I was hearing. These weren't just financial crimes. They were systematic destruction of lives, imprisonment of innocent people, possibly even murder. Dom, who's running this operation? That's where it gets interesting. The network appears to be coordinated by someone calling themselves the administrator. We haven't identified them yet, but they provide the infrastructure, the fake care facilities, the corrupt medical staff, the legal documentation, the offshore accounts. Emma and her lawyer accomplices are just field operatives. This revelation changed everything. I wasn't just fighting for my own freedom and assets. I was potentially the key to bringing down an entire criminal enterprise. There's more, Dominic said. I've been in contact with investigators in 3 other states where similar patterns have emerged. New Hampshire, Maine, and Connecticut all have cases that match this profile. We're talking about potentially dozens of victims and millions of dollars in stolen assets. What about the authorities? Surely someone has noticed the pattern? That's the brilliant part of their operation. Each case appears isolated, handled in different jurisdictions by different courts. The victims are portrayed as tragic cases of age-related mental decline or medical complications. Their family members, the perpetrators, appear to be devoted caregivers dealing with difficult situations. I thought about how convincing Judah had been in his conversations with Dr. Martinez. How naturally he'd slipped into the role of concerned husband dealing with his wife's deteriorating condition. How many judges had he fooled with similar performances? But, Robin, here's our opportunity, Dominic continued, his voice taking on an excited edge. You're the first victim who woke up before the process was complete. You're the first one who can provide testimony about the premeditation, the planning, the entire scope of the operation. What do you need from me? Everything, every conversation. You overheard. Every document you've seen, every detail about the trust manipulation. But more importantly, we need to coordinate with law enforcement before Judah realizes his plan has been compromised. That afternoon, Sophie helped me prepare for what would be the most important conversation of my life. Federal investigators, working with state attorneys general from multiple jurisdictions, were assembling a task force to investigate the network. My case would be their entry point into the larger conspiracy. But first, I needed to ensure my own safety. As long as Judah believed his plan was proceeding normally, I had the element of surprise. The moment he realized I was conscious and fighting back, I would become a threat that needed to be eliminated. We're walking a tightrope, I told Sophie as we reviewed the evidence I'd compiled. I need to appear weak and confused when Judah visits, while simultaneously building the case that will destroy him. What if he suspects something? What if he realizes the trust accounts have been frozen? Then we accelerate everything, because once he knows I'm onto him, I become the biggest threat to a multi-million-dollar criminal operation. And people like that don't leave loose ends. As if summoned by my words, I heard Judah's familiar voice in the hallway, talking to someone on his phone. Should be able to expedite the hearing. The sooner we get this resolved, the better for Everyone involved. I quickly closed the laptop and pretended to be sleeping, but my mind was racing. Time was running out, and I was about to discover just how dangerous a cornered predator could become. The moment I heard Judah's voice in the hallway, I knew I needed more than just evidence. I needed allies who could act on my behalf while I remained trapped in this hospital bed, pretending to be helpless. The network of criminals was extensive and well organized. My response needed to be equally strategic. After Judah's visit, during which I maintained my facade of confusion and weakness, Sophie helped me make the most important call of my counterattack. I needed someone with both legal authority and personal investment in stopping this conspiracy. "Justin Morrison?" I said when the familiar voice answered. Justin had been my closest friend at Vermont Community Bank before he'd been recruited by the state attorney general's office 5 years ago. "Robin? My God, I heard about your surgery. How are you feeling?" "Justin, I need your help with something that's going to sound impossible, but I need you to listen to every word." I spent the next 20 minutes laying out the entire conspiracy, providing him with names, dates, and the evidence Dominic had uncovered. The silence that followed was so long, I thought the call had dropped. Finally, Justin spoke, his voice tight, with controlled fury. "Robin, what you're describing, we've been tracking similar patterns across New England, but we haven't been able to connect the dots. You might be the break we've been looking for." "What do you mean?" 3 months ago, a man named Dr. Marcus Webb was flagged by our financial crimes unit for suspicious Medicare billing patterns. The same Dr. Webb who runs your Serenity Springs facility. We've been building a case, but we needed someone on the inside, someone who could provide first-hand testimony about their methods. This was better than I'd hoped. "What do you need from me?" "Everything you've got, but more importantly, we need you to stay exactly where you are and keep pretending to be incapacitated. We're going to use your situation to build a case that will bring down the entire network. Justin, the competency hearing is scheduled for Friday. If that goes through, it won't. I'm getting a federal judge involved tomorrow morning. We'll delay the hearing on the grounds of new evidence requiring investigation. But Robin, I have to warn you, once we start this process, you're going to be in real danger. These people have killed before." After ending the call with Justin, I realized I needed to expand my support network beyond law enforcement. I needed people who could act immediately if my situation became desperate, people who knew me well enough to spot if something went wrong. Sophie had become my primary ally, but she was limited by hospital protocols. I needed someone with more freedom of movement, someone who could coordinate with the authorities while monitoring my safety. "Sophie, I need to contact my neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Brennan." Mrs. Brennan was 78 years old, sharp as a tack, and had been watching our house and collecting our mail since my hospitalization. More importantly, she was a retired prosecutor who'd spent 30 years putting criminals behind bars. Mrs. Brennan answered her phone with her characteristic briskness. "Robin, dear, how are you feeling? That husband of yours says you're having some cognitive difficulties, but you sound perfectly clear to me. Mrs. Brennan, I need to tell you something in strict confidence, and I need your help," I explained. The situation, knowing that her legal background would help her understand the implications immediately. "That son of a bitch," she said when I finished, her refined demeanor cracking to reveal the prosecutor underneath. I knew something was off when he started asking me detailed questions about your daily routines last month. Said he was worried about your memory, but it felt like he was gathering intelligence. "What kind of questions?" "When you left for work, when you came home, whether you had visitors, if you'd been acting strangely." I thought he was being a concerned husband, but now I realize he was mapping your vulnerabilities. Mrs. Brennan agreed to coordinate with Justin's office and serve as my eyes and ears in the neighborhood. More importantly, she would monitor any suspicious activity around our house and report anything unusual to the authorities. My next call was to my former supervisor at the bank, Tom Williams. Tom had been promoted to regional manager and had connections throughout the financial services industry. If Judah and Emma were operating across multiple states, their activities would eventually show up in banking records. Tom, I need you to put out some quiet inquiries through your network. Look for patterns of elderly or incapacitated individuals having large sums transferred from their accounts, particularly to medical facilities or care providers. Jesus, Robin, how big is this thing? Potentially millions of dollars across multiple states. And Tom, be careful who you talk to. We don't know how deep this corruption goes. By evening, I had assembled a network of allies that stretched from federal investigators to local neighbors, from banking professionals to retired prosecutors. Each person had a specific role to play in the complex operation that would be required to bring down Judah's network while keeping me safe. But as I lay in my hospital bed that night, listening to the sounds of the night shift beginning their rounds, I realized that building a support network was only half the battle. The real challenge would be maintaining my deception while coordinating a multi-jurisdictional investigation, all while my husband grew increasingly suspicious of the delays in his carefully planned timeline. The competency hearing was now 3 days away, and every hour that passed increased the risk that Judah would realize his plan was falling apart. When that happened, I would discover just how far he was willing to go to protect his conspiracy. The next morning brought a development that changed everything. Dr. Martinez informed me that Judah had requested my discharge be expedited to later that afternoon, claiming I needed to be transferred to a specialized care facility for my ongoing recovery. Mrs. Blackwood, I have to be honest, Dr. Martinez said during his morning rounds, his voice carefully neutral. Your husband is very insistent that you be moved today. He's presented documentation from Serenity Springs Care Center indicating they have an opening that needs to be filled immediately. My blood ran cold. Judah was accelerating his timeline, probably because he'd noticed delays in the trust distributions or had grown suspicious of other factors. Once I was moved to Serenity Springs, I would be completely under his control, drugged into compliance and cut off from any allies. Doctor, I don't feel ready to leave, I said weakly, maintaining my facade of confusion. I'm still having memory problems and I feel so disoriented. That's exactly why your husband feels the specialized facility would be better equipped to help you, Dr. Martinez replied. But I caught something in his eyes. Doubt, perhaps even suspicion about Judah's eagerness to move me. The moment Dr. Martinez left, I called Justin Morrison on Sophie's phone. They're trying to move me today. Once I'm in that facility, I'll be completely cut off. Not happening, Justin said firmly. I've got federal marshals positioned at the hospital. The moment anyone tries to move you without proper court authorization, they'll intervene. But Robin, this means they're on to us. We need to accelerate our timeline too. Sophie helped me coordinate with my growing network of allies. Mrs. Brennan reported unusual activity at my house. A moving truck had arrived early that morning, and men were loading furniture and personal belongings. Judah was liquidating everything, preparing for his disappearance with Emma. Tom Williams called with disturbing news from his banking network investigation. Robin, we've found at least 12 other cases matching this pattern across New England. The amounts are staggering. We're looking at over $8 million in stolen assets. But the most crucial information came from Dominic Torres. I've identified the administrator, he said. It's Dr. Marcus Webb himself, the medical director at Serenity Springs. He's been running this operation for 5 years, using his medical credentials to provide legitimacy to the false diagnoses and incompetency declarations. The pieces were falling into place, but time was running out. Judah appeared at my bedside that afternoon with discharge papers and a transportation service to move me to Serenity Springs. The doctors say you're ready for the next phase of your recovery, he said, his voice artificially cheerful. This facility specializes in cognitive rehabilitation. You'll get the best care possible. I looked at him with what I hoped appeared to be confused gratitude. "If you think it's best, Judah, I trust you completely." The words tasted like acid in my mouth, but they seemed to reassure him. As he stepped out to finalize the transfer arrangements, Sophie squeezed my hand. "The marshals are in position," she whispered, "and Justin's team is ready to move. The moment they try to take you out of this hospital, everything happens at once." I nodded, my heart racing despite the medication meant to keep me calm. In the next few hours, either Judah's conspiracy would succeed and I would disappear into a nightmare of forced incapacitation, or my counterattack would destroy a criminal network that had operated with impunity for years. As I heard Judah's voice in the hallway, confirming transportation details with someone from Serenity Springs, I realized that the woman who had entered this hospital as a trusting wife was about to leave as something entirely different, either a victim silenced forever or a warrior who had brought down her predators. The perfect moment to spring my trap came at 3:47 p.m., when Judah returned with 2 orderlies from Serenity Springs and what appeared to be official transfer documentation. I recognized one of the men from Dominic's surveillance photos, Marcus Webb himself, though he was introduced to me simply as Dr. Williams from the care facility. "Mrs. Blackwood, we're here to help you transition to a more appropriate care environment," Webb said, his voice professionally warm, but his eyes cold and calculating. "Your husband has explained your condition, and we're specially equipped to handle patients with your particular needs." I looked at them with what I hoped appeared to be confused compliance. "Judah says it's for the best. I trust him completely." But as they began preparing the transfer wheelchair, I noticed Sophie frantically texting someone on her phone behind Webb's back. The federal marshals Justin had promised were somewhere in this hospital, waiting for the right moment to act. "There's just one small issue," Dr. Martinez said, appearing in the doorway with a clipboard. "I need to complete some final documentation before discharge. Mrs. Blackwood, I need to ask you a few routine questions about your current mental state for our records." Webb's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Doctor, we're on a tight schedule. The transfer vehicle is waiting, and we have other patients to collect today." "Other patients?" The casual way he said it sent chills down my spine. How many people were they moving today? How many other victims were being transferred to facilities where they would disappear forever? "I understand your schedule," Dr. Martinez replied firmly. "But hospital protocol requires these assessments. It will only take a few minutes." As Dr. Martinez began asking me seemingly routine questions about the date, my location, and recent events, I realized this was my window. Justin's team needed proof of the conspiracy in action, evidence that would hold up in court and connect all the participants. "I'm having trouble remembering things," I said, my voice weak and confused. "Judah says I've been having problems for months, but I don't remember that. Sometimes I feel like there are things I should know, but they're just gone." Webb stepped closer, his voice taking on a patronizing tone. "That's perfectly normal for someone in your condition, Mrs. Blackwood. The facility will help you manage these symptoms much more effectively than a general hospital can." "What kind of symptoms?" Dr. Martinez asked, directing the question to Webb. "Progressive cognitive decline, memory lapses, inability to manage complex tasks like financial decisions," Webb replied smoothly. "Her husband has documented a steady deterioration over the past several months." That's when Judah made his crucial mistake. "The episodes have been getting worse," he added, eager to support Webb's narrative. "Sometimes she doesn't even recognize me. She's tried to access bank accounts she has no memory of opening, making wild accusations about money being stolen." Dr. Martinez looked genuinely surprised. "That's interesting, because Mrs. Blackwood's cognitive assessments have been completely normal. She's shown excellent memory retention, logical thinking, and mathematical abilities." Webb's expression darkened. "General hospital assessments aren't sophisticated enough to detect the kind of subtle decline we're dealing with." That's exactly why she needs specialized care. The tension in the room was building toward a breaking point. I could feel the moment, approaching when pretense would be abandoned and the true nature of this confrontation would be revealed. In the hallway, I heard footsteps, multiple people walking with purpose toward my room. The perfect storm I had been orchestrating for days was about to break, and I was ready. The footsteps in the hallway belonged to exactly who I hoped they would: Justin Morrison, flanked by 2 federal marshals and a woman I recognized as Judge Patricia Hawthorne from the Federal District Court. The moment they entered my room, the entire dynamic shifted. "Gentlemen, I'm going to need everyone to stop what they're doing," Justin announced, his voice carrying the full authority of federal law enforcement. "This is a federal investigation, and this patient is under protective custody as of this moment." Webb's professional facade cracked instantly. "I don't understand. We have proper transfer documentation, signed by her physician and authorized by her husband." "Dr. Webb, yes, we know exactly who you are. Those documents are fraudulent, Judge," Hawthorne said, stepping forward with a folder of legal papers. "I've just signed a federal restraining order preventing the transfer of Mrs. Blackwood from this facility, pending a full investigation into allegations of conspiracy, fraud, and elder abuse." Judah's face went pale, but he tried to maintain his composure. "Judge, I think there's been some misunderstanding. My wife is mentally incompetent following surgical complications. I'm simply trying to get her the specialized care she needs." "Mr. Blackwood," I said, my voice suddenly clear and strong, dropping all pretense of confusion. "I think the misunderstanding is yours." The look of shock on his face was worth every moment of terror I'd endured over the past week. For the first time since waking up, I sat up fully in bed, my voice steady and my eyes completely alert. "You see, Judah, while you were planning to have me declared incompetent, I was documenting every aspect of your conspiracy. While you were stealing my money, I was working with federal investigators to freeze your assets. While you were preparing to ship me off to your partner's fake care facility, I was building the case that's going to put all of you in federal prison." Webb made a move toward the door, but the federal marshals were already in position. "Dr. Marcus Webb, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, and violation of federal racketeering statutes. And Emma Castellanos, also known as Emma Sinclair," Justin continued as another team of agents appeared with a woman in handcuffs. "You're under arrest for the same charges, plus identity fraud and conspiracy to commit murder in the deaths of 3 patients at facilities you operated in other states." Emma's carefully constructed facade completely dissolved. "This is impossible. She was supposed to be brain damaged. She was supposed to be incapacitated." "That's the thing about underestimating people," I said, looking directly at her. "Sometimes the person you think is helpless turns out to be the one with all the power." Judge Hawthorne opened her folder and began reading from official documents. "Based on evidence provided by Mrs. Robin Blackwood and a multi-state investigation, coordinated by federal authorities, I'm issuing immediate freezing orders on all assets associated with the Serenity Springs network, arrest warrants for 17 individuals across 4 states, and protective custody orders for 11 victims currently being held at various facilities." Judah, handcuffed and facing the destruction of everything he'd planned, looked at me with something approaching awe. "How did you know? How did you figure it all out?" I smiled at him, not with warmth, but with the cold satisfaction of someone who had turned the tables completely. 25 years of protecting people's money from criminals like you. You should have done your homework better. The legal foundation I'd built over the past week was about to bring down an entire criminal empire. With the arrests made and the immediate threat neutralized, the real work of dismantling the criminal network began. What happened next was a precisely coordinated operation that I had spent days planning from my hospital bed, using every connection and piece of leverage I could muster. "Jean, are you ready?" I said into Sophie's phone, speaking to the trust administrator who had been waiting for my signal. Execute the asset recovery protocols now. Within minutes, automated systems I had programmed days earlier began reversing every fraudulent transaction Judah and Emma had attempted. The beauty of the Blackwood Trust's security features, designed by paranoid old Nathaniel decades ago, was that they allowed for complete reversal of unauthorized activities once fraud was detected. Robin, we're recovering funds from 7 different offshore accounts, Jean reported. The automated trace protocols are following the digital breadcrumbs your husband left behind. He was sloppy with his electronic transfers. But the financial recovery was only part of my execution plan. Justin, Morrison coordinated with law enforcement agencies across 4 states to simultaneously raid the other facilities in the network. By evening, federal agents were rescuing victims who had been drugged and imprisoned for months or even years. The woman you knew as Catherine Mills is alive, Justin told me during his evening update. She's been held at a facility in New Hampshire for 3 years, but she's coherent and able to testify. Her assets were slowly being drained, just like they planned to do with yours. The scope of the recoveries was staggering. 11 victims were rescued from various facilities, with ages ranging from 52 to 87. The total amount of stolen assets exceeded $12 million across the network, but perhaps the most satisfying part of my execution was what happened to Emma's carefully constructed identity. Dominic Torres had worked with federal investigators to trace her real background, and what they found was a career criminal who had been operating under multiple identities for over 15 years. Emma Castellanos, real name Maria Elena Vasquez, has outstanding warrants in 3 other states, Dominic reported. She's been running variations of this con since she was 25 years old. The paralegal credentials were fake, the references were fabricated. Even her relationship history with previous lawyers was part of an elaborate long-term fraud. As for Judah, the man I had loved and trusted for 22 years was revealed to be something I never could have imagined. His financial desperation had made him vulnerable to recruitment, but his willingness to participate in the systematic destruction of innocent lives showed a moral bankruptcy that went far beyond simple greed. The gambling debts were real, Justin explained as we reviewed the evidence. He owed over $200,000 to some very dangerous people. Emma offered him a way out, but it required him to identify potential victims and provide legal cover for the operation. The house sale I had been dreading was immediately halted by federal court order. All proceeds from fraudulent transactions were frozen and marked for return to victims. Even the furniture and personal belongings that had been removed that morning were recovered and returned. By the end of the day, what had begun as a personal betrayal had become the foundation for the largest elder fraud prosecution in Vermont's history. The quiet accountant who was supposed to disappear into a drugged oblivion had instead orchestrated the downfall of an entire criminal enterprise. The execution was flawless, methodical, and absolutely devastating to those who had underestimated. The most satisfying moment came when I watched Judah realize the full scope of what had happened to him. As federal agents led him away in handcuffs, the magnitude of his miscalculations became clear, and his confident facade crumbled completely. "Wait," he said, stopping in the hospital corridor as the reality hit him. "The trust accounts. You couldn't have accessed those. I had all the passwords, all the authorization codes." I smiled from my hospital bed, finally able to drop the last pretense of weakness. "Judah, you never understood how the trust actually worked. You assumed that because you were the beneficiary, you had control. But Nathaniel was smarter than both of us. I wasn't just a co-trustee, I was the primary trustee with override authority." The blood drained from his face as he processed what that meant. "Every transaction you tried to authorize over the past week required my biometric confirmation," I continued. "Every attempt to access the historical documents, every effort to set up those automated distributions to Serenity Springs, all of it created alerts that went directly to Jean Patterson, who then contacted me. Emma, being led away by a separate team of agents, turned back toward my room with pure hatred in her eyes. "You ruined everything! Years of planning, Millions of dollars, dozens of operations across multiple states. That's right, I said, my voice carrying clearly down the hallway. I ruined everything. And I did it while you thought I was too brain damaged to remember my own name. But the trap I'd set went deeper than just catching the criminals. In the days that followed, as federal investigators dug into the network's operations, they discovered that my case had been the keystone holding up a much larger criminal enterprise. My cooperation and the evidence I'd gathered became the foundation for prosecutions that would span several years. Dr. Webb, facing federal charges that could result in life imprisonment, began cooperating with authorities within days of his arrest. His testimony revealed the full scope of the operation. Over 50 facilities across 10 states, more than 200 victims, and a network of corrupt lawyers, medical professionals, and financial advisors who had been systematically preying on vulnerable people for over a decade. You were supposed to be victim number 201, Justin told me during one of our debriefing sessions. Instead, you became the witness who brought down the entire operation. The personal satisfaction of watching my betrayers face justice was immense, but it was overshadowed by something even more important: the knowledge that my actions had saved lives. Catherine Mills, who I'd thought had simply left town years ago, was rescued from a New Hampshire facility where she'd been drugged into compliance for 3 years. Sandra Whitman's death was reclassified as a homicide, and her estate was restored to her rightful heirs. But perhaps the most poetic justice came when the assets seized from the criminal network were used to create a victim compensation fund. The money that Judah, Emma, and their accomplices had stolen was returned not just to their victims, but used to establish support services for other survivors of financial elder abuse. As I watched the news coverage of the arrests, I realized something profound. They had tried to erase me, to make me disappear into their system of exploitation and abuse. Instead, I had erased them, dismantling their entire operation from the inside out. The hunters had become the hunted, and the trap had been perfect. 6 months later, I sat in a federal courtroom watching as the final sentences were handed down. The trials had been swift and decisive, with overwhelming evidence and multiple cooperating witnesses ensuring that justice was served with remarkable efficiency. Judge Hawthorne looked down at Judah from her bench, her voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. Mr. Blackwood, you have been found guilty on 17 federal charges including conspiracy, elder abuse, fraud, and racketeering. Given the scope of this criminal enterprise and your role in targeting the most vulnerable members of our society, I sentence you to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. 25 years. At 57, Judah would be over 80 when he was released. If he lived that long. The man who had planned to steal my life and disappear to Costa Rica would instead spend the remainder of his productive years in a federal penitentiary. Emma, or Maria Elena Vasquez as her true identity had been established, received an even harsher sentence. 32 years, Judge Hawthorne announced. As the architect and coordinator of this criminal network, your sentence reflects not only the crimes we can prove, but the decades of devastation you have inflicted on innocent people. Dr. Marcus Webb, who had cooperated extensively with federal investigators, received 15 years. His cooperation had been crucial in identifying and rescuing victims and in unraveling the network's financial structures, but Judge Hawthorne made it clear that his medical oath made his betrayal particularly egregious. You used your medical credentials to provide legitimacy to a system of imprisonment and abuse, she told him. The trust that society places in medical professionals makes your crimes especially heinous. As the sentences were read, I felt a complex mix of emotions. There was satisfaction, certainly. The knowledge that justice had been served and that these predators could never again destroy innocent lives. But there was also sadness for the person I had been before all this began, the woman who had trusted completely and loved without reservation. The financial restitution was comprehensive. The Blackwood Trust was fully restored, with all attempted transfers reversed and additional penalties assessed against the criminal network. My personal accounts were replenished not just to their original levels, but with substantial damages awarded by the federal court. More importantly, the victim compensation fund established from the seized criminal assets had grown to over $15 million. This money was being used not just to compensate the direct victims of the network, but to establish support services, legal aid programs, and educational initiatives to help prevent similar crimes. Catherine Mills, whom I had finally met during the trial proceedings, had become a close friend and ally. Her recovery from 3 years of drugged imprisonment had been remarkable, and she had thrown herself into advocacy work for other victims of financial elder abuse. "What they did to us was horrible," she told me after the sentencing. "But what we've accomplished in response, the lives we've saved, the awareness we've raised, the systems we've changed, that's our real victory." The trials were over, the criminals were imprisoned, and the victims were on their paths to recovery. Justice had been served with a thoroughness that would have seemed impossible when I first woke up in that hospital bed, realizing that my husband was planning to destroy my life. But the most important resolution was still to come, deciding who I would become in the aftermath of this complete betrayal and ultimate victory. 1 year after waking up to discover my husband's betrayal, I stood in the offices of Blackwood Financial Protection Services, the company I had built from the ashes of my old life. The nameplate on my desk read, Robin Blackwood, founder and CEO, but the title that mattered most to me was printed underneath, Victim Advocate and Financial Crimes Specialist. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. In the months following the trials, I had struggled with depression, anger, and a profound sense of displacement. The woman who had trusted completely, who had built her identity around being a devoted wife, had died in that hospital room. The person who emerged was stronger, but also more guarded, wiser but scarred by the knowledge of how thoroughly another human being could betray someone who loved them. "Mrs. Blackwood, your 3 o'clock appointment is here," my assistant announced. Sophie Martinez had left nursing to become my first employee, drawn by our shared experience and her natural protective instincts. My 3 o'clock was a 72-year-old woman named Margaret Chen, whose son had been systematically stealing from her accounts while convincing her she was developing dementia. The pattern was familiar, too familiar, and I felt the old fury rise as I listened to her story. "Margaret, you're not crazy, and you're not losing your memory," I told her. "What you're describing is financial elder abuse, and we're going to stop it." This was why I had transformed my pain into purpose. Every week, people like Margaret came to my office, confused and frightened, believing they were losing their minds, when actually they were being victimized by people they trusted. My experience had given me unique insights into how these crimes operated, and more importantly, how to stop them. The Blackwood Trust, now worth over $3 million thanks to successful investments and the restitution from the criminal case, funded our operations. We provided free services to victims of financial abuse, working with law enforcement, legal advocates, and medical professionals to identify and prosecute perpetrators. Catherine Mills had become my partner in the advocacy work. Her recovery from years of imprisonment had been inspiring, and together we had testified before Congress about the need for stronger protections for vulnerable adults. Our work had resulted in new federal legislation that closed many of the loopholes that criminals like Emma and Webb had exploited. "You know what the best part is?" Catherine said during one of our evening planning sessions. "They thought they were destroying us, but instead they created the 2 people most qualified to destroy them." She was right. My 25 years in financial services, combined with first-hand experience of sophisticated fraud schemes, had made me uniquely qualified to identify and prevent these crimes. What Judah and Emma had meant as my destruction became the foundation for protecting hundreds of other potential victims. The house on Maple Street had been sold, and I'd moved to a smaller place outside of town. I didn't need the large colonial anymore. It had been designed for a life I would never live again. My new home was practical, secure, and most importantly, truly mine. I had learned something profound in that hospital bed. Sometimes the person you become after betrayal is stronger, more purposeful, and more valuable to the world than the person you were before. They had tried to erase Robin Blackwood, the trusting wife. Instead, up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.